Hello and welcome back to Team Genius Live. My name is George. I'll be your host today. This is a special episode where I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague and friend Karim Harbott. We are covering his upcoming book, The 6 Enablers of Business Agility. We're going to be spending the better part of an hour together, going to go into where the book idea comes from, who it's for, why you should put it high up on your reading list, and where the experience comes from that will make your path towards business agility ever so easier. All that and a bit of background information also about the book writing process is coming up in just a minute. So welcome to this very special episode of Team Genius Live. We have a special guest with us today. Karim Harbott is coming on in just a second. Karim's been around the block quite a few times, has a wonderful background, but there is no man better to share his background than the man himself. So without further ado, here is Karim Harbott. Karim, welcome to the show. How are you, my friends?
I'm very well, thank you, George. Good to be on your show. I'm honored, and I like your little intro animation there. That was very cool.
Thank you. It's pretty new. I invested a huge sum on Fiverr with a great designer who helped me with that one.
It's great.
Very nice.
It's good to be on, man. How are you doing today? Are you all right?
Yes, yeah, we had a stroke of luck. The little one slept through, which is nice. He's recovering from a little illness and getting better by the day. Thank you very much for asking. Yeah, how are you feeling today?
I feel good, a little tired. My own fault, staying up too late reading books is my vice. But in terms of vices, that's probably not the worst one, is it? So there we go. I'll be okay.
I agree. Yes, staying up and researching. I mean, bedtime is important, sleep is important, and yeah, it's an ongoing struggle, right? Satisfying our interest and finding enough time in the day in order to nurture them. Very nice. Very good. So we know each other a little bit for a few years and continuing to learn more about each other. But I'm guessing we have some viewers on here. I just want to make sure that everything is coming through okay. So we have a few people who are streaming. If you could just let us know. If you're hearing this, then let us know in the comments where you're joining the stream from. And we can carry on from there. And while we're waiting for those to come in, Karim, could you share with everybody what your background is? How did you come into this field? Who are you?
Absolutely. But first, my apologies if you hear some banging. It seems there are some squirrels having a party on my the roof of my office. It's their dance floor. So sorry about that. Hopefully they get bored and go and chase nuts very shortly. My background, if we go way back, I was a software engineer. I was writing COBOL and all sorts of fun stuff. I did that for a few years. I very quickly became a project manager in the waterfall space. So I lived that pain and tried to deliver these big complex projects in a way that maybe doesn't work as well as some other ways. Felt it firsthand. Then I accidentally became a Scrum Master purely because someone asked me to go and be a Scrum Master in my company, and it sounded like something I should probably try. I didn't really know what it was at that point, and then it became clear what it was, and it became clear that I quite enjoyed it. So I then spent the next 5 or 6 years really trying to get good at the Scrum Master role before kind of falling into the sort of Agile coach role, as many do, over another sort of 5 or 6 years. And doing that, and my focus now is I love working with teams. I love helping to create high-performing teams. What I found was that most of the impediments to high performance are way beyond the reach of the team. It's organizational, so I now try to fix those problems so that teams can work better on the ground. And so my focus is more organizational and leadership now. That's been my journey.
Awesome, excellent. So we're getting feedback that it is all coming through. So hello, Lars. Thanks for joining in from Belgium. Hello, Yannick. Thanks for joining in from London. Wonderful. Yeah, the path that you share seems to be a common one for people who ultimately then end up in the sort of more all organizational sphere. And that actually leads me to a question that's been on my mind. The book is titled 6 Enablers to Business Agility. And there is another term floating around called enterprise agility. What is the difference between business agility and enterprise agility, would you say?
It's a good question. So I tend not to use the term enterprise agility. I don't, maybe it's too many vowels in there for me to say without falling over it. I've always used business agility. I'll be honest. I think the two things are saying largely the same thing. And what they're saying is, this great movement emerged coming up 20 years ago now, but actually before that, right? Of agile at the team level, and all the values and principles that go along with that. And what we're saying is, let's take those values and principles and practices and let's apply them to whole organizations, so the whole organization can respond easily and quickly and cheaply to an uncertain world, rather than just teams working on a product. So it's, can your business continually innovate, continually adapt, continually respond? That's what I would call business agility, right? And I use the term that my mentor, the late Mike Beadle, used to use, and maybe I should give it more thought. Do I use business agility or enterprise agility? I've always used business agility, but I think enterprise agility is largely saying the same thing. It's like, let's get beyond software development, let's get beyond IT, and let's apply these principles to the whole organization. So from my perspective, there's very little difference.
Okay, thank you. And we are celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Manifesto for Agile Software Development this year. So in a way, that kind of segues on to the next question. Where does the idea for the book come from, or what was the motivation behind writing the book?
The motivation, well, writing the book, I'll talk about why I created the model. Writing the book happened almost by accident. But why did I create the 6 enablers of business agility, which started off as a model for helping organizations to achieve business agility, right? I touched on it briefly earlier. There's a lot of stuff in the way of teams from being effective, right? You can get a really great team, real great trust, great team dynamics, great Scrum Master, great developers, great, all of these things, right? But if you're stuck in an organization that is preventing you from being effective, then this is going to be a problem. And this is largely what agile transformations, whatever that term means to you, are trying to address. And I've worked on many of them. I've worked on too many of them. Like we met at a particular bank that was going through an agile transformation many years ago. And the thing that they miss, they send their teams on training, right? You go on this Scrum training, or I don't want to pick on any particular framework, go and do that and then go away and be agile, right? And that was almost the entirety of agile transformations back then. And the team comes back, is learned a few tools and techniques, and it's no more effective than it was before because of those organizational impediments, that I call them, that are in the way. And so I thought to myself, as a coach, I thought, well, let me help the leaders try to understand what these organizational impediments are, and some patterns to get past them, so that they can unlock the effectiveness of those teams, right? Because they're being blocked right now. And the metaphor I use for that is, if you have a Ferrari in a traffic jam, then tuning the engine of the Ferrari doesn't make it go faster, right? That's working on the team. Moving those cars out of the way helps it to go faster, and that's working on those organizational impediments. So me being me, I like to come up with a list and categorize things, because that's how my little brain works. So I started coming up with these lists, and I actually found a whole bunch of early ones from 2015, when this was emerging, right? And I had a big long list. But I condensed it down to 6, and organizations are focusing on just one of those 6. The other 5 they were ignoring. So I created this model really for awareness and to help with the transformations to be more effective. That was the motivation behind it.
Excellent. I have a slight side question. You were very kind. You actually sent me an advanced copy of the book, and I do have to admit to you and everybody else, I haven't had time to read the whole thing, but enough of it so we can have a good conversation today. And this may be covered in the book, but I am wondering, the aforementioned transformation efforts is similar to others where you actually have several coaches trying to work together to help the organization at large. Is there something in the book that helps people to organize around something like that, where you actually have supporters from the outside to help the organization in the pursuit of putting these enablers for business agility in place in terms of coaches and change agents and how they should organize themselves in order to further that mission?
There is at the end of the book, I end with a chapter called "Leading the Change," and that's how do you pull this all together. One of the many reasons that transformations fail, right? I mean, the key one is they don't address all 6 of the enablers, right? So they're leaving a lot of change on the table. We'll come to what those enablers are, but another key one is, and I found this at a different bank that I was working with, is there's not a coherence around what's being done. You've got some coaches over here doing some stuff, some coaches over there doing some stuff. There's no one who stands back and says, what's the big picture? How does this change over here relate to this change over here to relate to this change over there? Because everything's interconnected, right? We know that about complex adaptive systems. Everything impacts everything else. So if there's not a level of coherence about how the pieces hang together, then you just, in the same way, business strategy, right? Everything needs to move towards that goal. You A, need to understand what the goal is, and B, how your changes or how you think your change is going to move you towards that and interact with each other. So the tool I use for that is something called the Business Agility Canvas. And that is a tool I created really to help visualize the change. And it's very much inspired by Alex Osterwalder's business model canvas, except it's not a business model, it's a canvas for your organizational change. And so that, of course, uses the 6 enablers of business agility. It's all integrated, and that's the tool, big visual tool that I use to coordinate the changes and to provide alignment and to communicate the changes being made. And so I talk about that in the final chapter.
Excellent. So this canvas is a useful tool. You shared it on LinkedIn some time ago also, and it's been getting pretty good reception. I looked at it too. I think it's really great. Just as you say, not only as a communication and not only as a planning tool to actually align around what's important and how do we go about it, but also as a communication tool. So what we'll do, actually, I just wanted to share before we make the reveal of what those 6 enablers are. In a couple of hours, there will be an update to this site. If you go to 6enablers.com right now, you'll just get forwarded to the Amazon listing for the book. But if you hold off for a couple of hours, Karim will release an update to this where you can actually find an overview of the 6 enablers. You'll be able to find a link to the canvas and a link over to the book for pre-orders. So that'll be coming up in the next in a couple of hours after we end the show. Just wanted to throw that in there.
Thanks. Just to jump in on that, so the Business Agility Canvas is free. You can download that for free. There's a 20-page guide that goes with it as well. I just want people to use it because I think it's going to be really valuable to prevent some of the mistakes I've learned over the last 12 years of trying to do this. Right? So go away and use that, and it's super easy to get going with it.
Yeah, awesome. And I think that's really important, because you've obviously experienced so much that enabled you to succinctly and to synthesize all of that experience and then succinctly portray it in something that looks deceivingly simple, right? But it needs to be that simple for people to get going. Would you say that's true?
Yes, it needs to be. So my initial list, it started life as a checklist, on a spreadsheet, which I love, right? I'm always paranoid that I'm going to forget stuff, right? So I made these checklists, and then I started grouping things, and there were loads of categories, right? I won't talk to you about how many categories there were, right? But you wouldn't want to just present that on a page because it would just be it would overwhelm everyone's brain. It would be like looking at the safe big picture, dare I say it, right? So I didn't. I'm just kidding, right? I didn't want that. So when I wanted to create it down to something that was easily understandable, then it's when I started teaching leadership workshops really that I had to make it more understandable, because a checklist I work through on a transformation is one thing, but when I start teaching the model in Cal classes largely, it was, all right, I can't just give you a list of everything you need, because your brain will explode. So I had to spend time simplifying it, which is not a trivial thing to do. And the groupings, the way you slice and dice it can go many different ways. I ended up with those 6, what I initially called impediments to business agility. And then I was told to stop being so grumpy and make it more positive. So I made enablers, because they can be impediments or enablers depending on how you do them, right? So There are basically 6 areas that can either help you or work against you. Let's put it that way. And yeah, it's much simpler now and much easier to communicate. And I can remember them without a spreadsheet.
That is indeed quite important. So we're about to go into the 6 enablers of business agility. This is what the book is going to look like when it goes on sale. So just to have a visual in there as well. Very clear. And I like the subtitle, How to Thrive in an Uncertain World. So tell us a bit more about that, the increase in uncertainty and why that's important.
Yeah, well, I created that title before the pandemic hit, by the way. So it just happens to have become more relevant. And this is the thing, right? And I talk about this in the sort of many of the talks that I give. When the business climate is pretty stable, as it was for certainly the first half of the 20th century, right? There's no real need for this stuff. Right? You can just do what you're doing already, just get better at it and keep going and get more efficient at doing the same thing. Right? That's how to thrive in a stable world. That's efficiency. It's industrial revolution, right? And that's how many organizations are designed, because many organizations were designed from that period, because that's when organizations started to spring up. They went from very small to very big in that second industrial revolution, right? But when the world changes quickly, right, when you can't predict 5 years, 10 years in advance, like Ford made the Model T almost unchanged for 19 years, right? I mean, you don't get to do that anymore. Right? Could you imagine? Like, I looked at some early iPhones in 2007. They don't look great, right? And the early iPods look even worse, right? So everything changes so much. The product development life cycle has shrunk. The world changes more quickly. New technologies get adopted far more quickly. New organizations reach $1 billion valuation in months rather than decades, right? And in this turbulence, this VUCA, this volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, being really great at what you do now is useful, but it doesn't help you survive and thrive in the long term. You also need to be great at creating new things and responding to a changing environment. So there's now 2 things you need to be good at: doing what you already do and creating the new. Right? And that's how you survive and thrive in uncertainty. Is can you create, can you innovate, can you respond? And if you're not designed to do that, if you're on an oil tanker and someone's saying, well, you need to just do a quick U-turn and go the other way, right? That's not easy. Right? So it's addressing all of these problems, and it's patterns for surviving and thriving in a world that is unpredictable and changeable.
And as you open the book, almost the dedication of the whole book reads, for those leaders who are smart enough to know they need change and brave enough to try. Yeah, that's beautiful. What brought you to putting that in very prominently on a page before you actually open up into the content?
Because I think that most people I speak to recognize the world has changed. Right? They recognize that organizations need to evolve. That's why so many agile transformations are happening. Right? Very few are either aware of just quite how difficult and painful that is, and how far and wide the organization needs to change. So most aren't even aware, but even those that are aware, most just aren't prepared to do it. Most aren't prepared to fundamentally reinvent their organizations, right? And so for me, what this book is aimed at, that quite narrow subset of people who know they want to change, they know how tough it is, and they still want to do it. Because I think many will read this and be like, oh, this sounds great, but I'm not sure it's for me. Just like, I'd love to run a 3-hour marathon, right? But do I want to pound the pavements for 6 months? Probably not, right? So this book is really for those people who do want to do it. So that's why that was in there. It's just, that's who it's for, right? Ultimately, I want those people to read it, be inspired by it, and to try and put these things into practice.
Excellent. As it usually happens with these types of things, there is often a crowd of early adopters, usually people like you, perhaps people like me, coaches who work with leaders and organizations to help them through it. So how would you define leader in the context of this statement? I'll just read it one more time. For those leaders who are smart enough to know they need change and brave enough to try.
leaders of the organization, because for me to reinvent an organization, and there's lots of debate, and I'm fully aware that many in the industry disagree with my perspective here, right? But once we start looking at the enablers, right, these are the key structural elements of organizations that need to change to enable them to be more nimble, more adaptive, more innovative, right? And I just don't see how those things are driven from the bottom up, right? I'm not saying that we don't want bottom-up involvement and bottom-up passion and desire to do it, but really, if you're going to make these big structural changes, there's a small number of people who have the authority to do that at the moment in organizations, and that's the leadership, right? So for me, the leaders are the leaders of the organization, and those same leaders of the organization need to drive the transformation, just like they would drive any large-scale organizational transformation, right? It's driven from the top with support from the bottom and the middle. So those are the people who decide whether to do this, decide whether to do it well, and if they go all in, then great. But if they don't, you're going to have a hard time making these changes.
Makes absolute sense. Wonderful. So I just wanted to turn to our viewers. If you have any questions for Karim as we go through this, feel free to put it in the comments and we'll pick them up as we go. Thank you very much for tuning in. Without any further ado, we're actually going to reveal now the 6 enablers of business agility, and we've prepared a little visual aid here. Karim, how should we look at this?
So we look at it in these are separate things, but they're not, as they would say in the consulting world, MECE. They're not mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. In that something can be in one, but also be in another, right? So and again, so interconnected. But if you're going to try and group these things together, this is a way of doing it, right? So I just like the way when I teach it and when I wrote about it, I start in that top left, leadership and management, and I move around clockwise in terms of the way that I address it. No particular reason other than I want to start at leadership and management because I think everything starts there. Everything starts with leaders changing the way they show up and their mindset and their ways of approaching what they do, right? And then they drive all of the changes in the other things, right? So I mean, I can just walk through them super quickly. We can do a deep dive later if you like. But
let's do that. Yeah.
So that's for me, right? This is moving away from the traditional command and control leadership and management styles to a more empowering, with decentralizing authority, with helping to grow those around you. There's elements of servant leadership, supportive leadership, agile leadership. It's a very different model. And so I just wanted to talk about the history of leadership and why decentralizing decision-making and self-managing teams is something that works well in high VUCA environments. And the leader's role is no longer to tell people how to do the work. It's more what direction are we going? What kind of structures do we have in place? What kind of culture do we want to create? Rather than, you need to do this and that, because I think there are people who are better placed to make those decisions on the ground. So if we start with leadership and management, then we have a hope of getting some of these other things in place. Now, culture is an interesting one, right? It comes up in the State of Agile report as one of the biggest impediments to this, right? It's almost always number one or number two. Organizational culture at odds with Agile values and principles always comes up as the top impediment, right? Because if we don't address the culture, then nothing else matters. It's like the and by the way, I refer to this as the underlying organizational operating system of an organization, right? These enablers, right? So if we look at, I'll come back to culture in a minute. I'm going on a detour as I do sometimes. If we look at ways of working, this is your processes, your practices, your tools, your frameworks, Scrum, user stories, all of those things, right? Which is where most people focus. If you try to use those things without changing those other 5 enablers, culture, structure, people and engagement, governance and funding, leadership, it's not going to work, just like it won't work if you install an Android app on an iPhone, right? It just isn't designed for that environment. So unless you address those other 5 enablers, create an underlying organizational operating system that will accept these new ways of working, it's never gonna happen, right? And culture is key to that. Okay? Culture is the way people think, the underlying assumptions, beliefs, about the organization, right? How safe we feel. Is a culture of secrecy or transparency, of safety or of fear, of experimentation or of prediction, right? And if you don't get that right, I guess it will be very difficult to do anything else. Okay, so culture for me is where you start. Where are we? Where do we want to be? And it's something you define as to what you want, and then all of the changes you make are in alignment with that. Right? So that culture is really, really important to focus on. And again, it goes hand in hand with leadership and management, right? Because leadership behaviors are one of the things that create the culture. And so, again, is an instance of them being interlinked. The next one is structure. That's much easier to explain. That's how do your teams come together? Are they cross-functional, or are you in silos? Are you in more of a divisional structure or more of a functional structure? Can you collaborate? Are you self-organizing? What about if you have multiple teams? How do they interact with each other? Right? How do you structure the organization? Is it like value stream, or is it by? So it's all of that stuff. Talking about the effectiveness of cross-functional, autonomous teams. We know all of this stuff. How that fits into the bigger picture in terms of a network of autonomous teams working towards a common goal. How we build trust across all of those teams. How we build alignment across all of those teams. Okay, and how that fits into the wider organization. So. From a very people-focused, two very people-focused things to a very organizationally focused one there, structure. And back to people, with people and engagement. Because it's terrible figures. We've probably all seen them, right? 15% of people engaged globally in the 2017 report. We're due an update to that, I think. Yeah. And so it's the HR policies. Because if you don't have... if you have HR policies that incentivize individual behaviors, yet you want to see collective team-based behaviors, that's not going to work. Right? And so a lot of HR is designed for industrial revolution times. How do we have a constant coaching conversation and growth and again, decentralize as much decision-making and give as much trust as possible? How do we get people to be engaged? And so how do we reinvent HR really to create organization? That's not creating an HR that works in an agile way. That's creating HR that is an empowering and it helps people to be engaged in the job that they do. And again, it all plays into culture and leadership and all of that. And then finally, the one I really want to talk about, governance and funding. It sounds really dry, right? But if you've got upfront business cases and fixed scope, and then you're just executing against that without the ability to respond, and you've got big 12 to 18 months planning cycles, nothing else is going to happen. Like, it's never going to happen, right? So, and I offer, it's one of the number one questions I get in my class, Scrum classes, right? It's like, how can we inspect and adapt at the sprint review if our scope is fixed and we can't change it? And my answer is you can't. And then they say, well, what's the point of the sprint review then? And my answer is there isn't one. Don't bother with it if you can't make the changes from the feedback you get. All right, it's just otherwise it's just a pointless exercise. So what I talk about in here is how do we invest money in an incremental way? Let's try many things, cheap experiments. There's lean startup in there. There's business model canvas in there. There's validating your business ideas, and there's just incremental VC type funding of projects based on data and the ability to respond to change. Right? We might think this is the idea. Actually, something else turns out to be the idea, and that's okay because that's a better idea. Right? So if you don't have an enabling governance and investment policy, everything else is going to go out the window, right? And again, ways of working is just very specific to an organization, and I won't spend much time on that because we spend a lot of time on that in the agile world. And so, if you're covering all of those areas and the patterns in there in a coherent way, you've got a chance of succeeding.
That's probably the first question that comes to my mind there, because you continuously referred to how each of the 6 enablers is interlinked with at least one of the other 6 enablers.
Yeah.
Where do we start?
It's like a web. It's like a web, isn't it? Which is why I created the canvas, because if you've created a team structure that doesn't support your governance structure, and great, if you're telling people they need to experiment more, right? That's a cultural change. But if you don't have the governance policies to enable that, then that's not going to work. If you're telling people they need to collaborate more, organizational structure, cross-functional team-based outcomes, but yet your HR policies are incentivizing individual behavior, then it's not going to work. So the reason the canvas is there is like, are these things coherent? Do they hang together? Just like you would in a business model canvas, right? Does your business model elements hang together? And so the question of where you start is, You start on the top row of that canvas with your vision, your values, and your success criteria for the transformation. The next thing I would do, other than a bit of leadership education, is a culture assessment. Where are we, and where do we want to be? Right? Because then you can start designing the experiments in structure and all the other areas that will ideally move you towards a new type of culture and change that culture, right? But if you don't know where you are and where you want to be, then it's pretty difficult to put the right things in place in all those other areas to move you in that direction. So I start with vision, values, success criteria, and culture assessment. And then you run a bunch of experiments in those other areas and you keep measuring and see if it's moved you in the direction you want it to be moving in.
Yeah. So the value of running experiments, for those who are not across that topic, experiments come from the area of science, applying the scientific method. How is that important in the context of business agility?
It's important because, like any complex system, organizations are unpredictable, right? That's one of the hallmarks of a complex system, is cause and effect aren't always known in advance. So if I do A, B will happen. Now, there are times where you can say that, right? Like if you're just looking at structural engineering and like, if I use this material, it will hold this load, because these formulas exist. These rules are obeyed, right? The rules of physics don't just change from country to country. So we can know this, right? Unless you're moving at the speed of light, let's not go there. Right? Now, I can see you thinking it, right? But with some things, you can make those predictions by analysis, not with organizational change. There are too many moving parts, right? So all you can do is know that there are patterns that have worked in other organizations, try them in your context. They may work, they may not, right? But if they don't, you try something else and you've learned from it. And so it's taking this experimental, trying these things and seeing if they move you in the right direction approach, rather than here's the blueprint, just implement this. We've come and we've told you exactly what the steps are. And if you do these things, you will be successful, which is what many organizations will tell you, right? But that's just not how it works in real life. So it's taking an experimental approach rather than a predictive approach, which is, after all, exactly what we're doing at the product level with agility anyway. And so we're just using that for the organizational change, using those same principles of experimentation.
Okay. And next, it would be good to jump into these with a few other key points and draw those out. I just would like to turn to the viewers. Once again, if you have any questions for Karim as we go through this, just put them in the comments. We'll pick them up. So far, we've got a bit of an overview of what the 6 enablers of business agility are all about. What do you think about them? Do you like them? If you like them, smash the like button on the video. Always helps with the YouTube algorithm, to be frank. And if you have any follow-up questions, let us know also. Now, you said you tend to start at the leadership and management level. So what does it look like when the change is actively driven by leadership?
Well, it's like rare, but it looks like. So I've been there are three situations, right, and 2 are common and 1 is rare, right? The first situation is leadership and management aren't involved at all, in which case you've got almost no chance of success. The other one, and it's the one I see quite a lot, is the senior leadership are bought into this change, right? You hear that a lot when you're working with them. They're definitely bought in, and then when you turn up, it's like, well, yes, they're bought in, but you don't see them for a year. Right? Now, so it's great being bought in, but we need you to quickly and actively remove impediments and drive the change and set the direction and come together, right? So you don't just need to buy in, you need to actively drive it. And actively driving it means meeting frequently to see how it's going, right? Actually, we rewind. Like setting the direction, setting the vision, helping people understand the why behind the change, right? Starting with why is always a good idea. And coming up with the success criteria, because just being agile doesn't mean anything, right? What value do we want from this? Why is this important to us to do now rather than just doing more of what we do? Okay, so there's defining that and communicating that vision, which is not something you do once, right? You do it continually because mostly people don't listen or hear, right? So you need to do it over and over again. And then there's having a high level view of, well, if we're going to change the structure, I need to be involved in that as a leader, because who else can do it? If we're going to change governance, you probably need your finance director in there. If we're going to change HR policies, you need your HR director in there. Right? If you're going to change culture, you need all the senior leadership in there. Right? And so if you don't have all those people, and who sits above all of those people, by the way, right? There's only one person normally. So if you don't have those people coming together to collaborate on a bi-weekly or monthly cadence, saying, here's what we're doing, here are the challenges, can you help us with this? Does everything still hang together? Are we moving in the right direction, not in the right direction? If you don't have that cadence of senior leaders coming in and showing an interest in what's happening and driving those changes, then it won't work. So that looks like active involvement and collaboration and meetings of each other in order to plan this stuff, right? And the canvas is one way for them to do that. There are other ways too, right? But I would expect them to be talking to each other frequently about this, not just expecting reports to land on their desk each week or each month.
Absolutely. So we got a bit of feedback on the initial introduction. Lars shares, looking good, looking forward to reading the details. Yannick is still writing. Wow, thank you very much. And yeah, so I think what Yannick has been seeing, ways of working as the starting point, bottom-up change, is definitely true. So Karim, what you're suggesting basically means that senior leaders need to get together a lot more than they do right now. A common complaint or, common statements that I hear when I engage with them is, they don't have time for that.
Yeah.
How do you respond?
Well, it's a common thing I get when I teach product owner classes. Is product owners, true empowered product owners, if they're senior enough, we don't have time, right? But I'd remind people that Steve Jobs had time to do reviews every other week during product development, right? He sat down and he looked at the progress. And I would say when they were designing new buildings at Apple and at Pixar, he was deeply involved in what those buildings should be like, because they were going to shape the culture. And I talk about many case studies in here, right? From General Stanley McChrystal from his book Team of Teams, right? He was a 4-star general driving transformation of a huge unit, the Joint Special Operations Command in Iraq, who were tasked with defeating Al Qaeda in Iraq. He led the change. David Marquet led the change on the USS Santa Fe, the submarine that they reinvented. If you go back far enough to the NUMMI example, the Toyota General Motors culture change case study, it was driven by leadership. Ricardo Semler drove the leadership at Semco, and Satya Nadella driving the change at Microsoft right now, right? So for me, if you don't have time to focus on the organizational culture, the structure, and everything around how an organization operates, I mean, what else is the job of a CEO or a senior leader, right? That is the job. And setting the strategy and the direction and the vision and creating the environment where people can move towards that, that is what you should be doing, right? If you're too busy, you're probably a bit more hands-on than you need to be, right? And we walk through a leadership development program in leadership and management chapter. We talk about leadership agility, and we just had Bill Joyner, the creator, on at our meetup talking about that, which is really great. And he talks about largely 3 levels of leadership: expert leadership, which is your I know best, I'll answer every question and solve every problem, in which case you're super busy. Achiever leadership is where you're kind of more strategic, and then catalyst leadership, where you create an inspiring vision and culture and empower everybody to move towards that. If you're at that catalyst leadership stage, right, your focus is this stuff. And that's the point that we want to get across. If you're too busy, you're probably doing things you shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, those 3 levels remind me of Rebecca Watson. She wrote a book, Conscious Leadership, some years ago, and she had very similar levels and definitions. So that seems to be a theme in the leadership development area. What you just mentioned in terms of the importance of C-suite to actively build this into the way that they operate as a team. And if they don't do that, then there's probably a point where the whole thing is not entirely set up for success. So Yannick asked here, now, is there a point when you decide there's no more you can do to help an organization with this kind of challenge? Would you say that's one of those indicators?
Me as a coach is that,
Yeah.
yeah, all the time, right? And again, this is almost one of the things that helps me with that, because if you and the canvas is a great tool, because if you see you've got in the middle, you've got 6 boxes for these things, right? You've got some other stuff above and below, but you've got 6 boxes. If you see a bunch of post-its in ways of working, send everyone on a Scrum class, start writing user stories, install Jira. I'm exaggerating slightly, right? But right, and you see nothing in the other boxes, you can step back and say, I don't think your chances of success are super high. It's like the sportsman or sportswoman who doesn't want to go to the gym, doesn't want to put the work in, doesn't want to do the training, but they'll change their diet, right? They'll do one of the areas and ignore all the others. Like, you're not going to see that person in the Olympics anytime soon. And so as a coach, I'd say, well, do I want to work with you, or do I want to work with someone who's going to commit to all of these things? And so absolutely, I early on, actually, the culture assessment's a really, really useful tool, because here's where we are, here's where we want to be. If that where we want to be is not the kind of culture that is consistent to these things working well, then great. Firstly, there's nothing wrong with that. All it means is what they value is different to what I value, and it's their organization. So I can respect where they want to go, but I'm not the person to help you if that's what you want, right? Go and get someone who'll help you be better at what you do right now, and there are plenty who will. So yeah, I often find myself saying, I can teach you Scrum, but your biggest problem is somewhere else, and it starts to be unfulfilling staying in an organization is not going to get the results it wants. So you don't want to slip into what my buddy Jem calls mortgage-driven development, which is staying somewhere because they pay the bills. All right, I've done that. It's not much fun, and I prefer to have an impact. So yeah, is the answer to that, absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Yannick. Yeah, so that seems to hit the spot. And it is also a segue, because you just mentioned the organizational culture again. And we also got a like on what we've been doing so far. So that's always nice. Thank you very much. And you just mentioned the organizational culture again, and in the book you say, if the desired culture is in conflict, then I would question whether the push for transformation should go ahead. What are some of those indicators? So say you use that canvas, which just to mention it again, we will also put up on the site that's going up in a couple of hours after the live stream. So if you're watching the replay, then it will already be live there. What does that mean if the desired culture is in conflict? So I'm assuming you do the canvas, walk them through what's the current organization culture, what's the desired organization culture, and then you've got this in here about the desired culture in conflict. What does it mean?
So I actually do often do the culture assessment before we get to the canvas. Interestingly, it's one of the first things. After leadership education, what I do is because in that session, and I will talk about frameworks for assessing, diagnosing, and shifting your culture. And my preferred framework is the competing values framework, which is rooted in 30 years of research and application. Right, this is well known in business. Right, and it largely talks about 2 dimensions. Right. Stability and control versus flexibility and adaptiveness. And there's no right and wrong, because some organizations need stability and control over flexibility and adaptiveness. And I'd say a nuclear power station would be one example of that, right? An air traffic control organization would be another, right? I just want today to look like yesterday. Thank you very much, right? Because if it doesn't, something's gone wrong. And that's fine, right? And then there's the constantly reinventing yourself, innovating, right? And then the other side is where your focus is, whether it's mainly internal or largely external. And you've got the 4 culture types on top of that, which is control, compete, create, collaborate. And I don't want to go too deep into this, right? So there is an assessment tool that goes with that. And if you are not wanting to move largely away from the stability and control towards the flexibility and adaptiveness in some way, then what you're saying to me is you value stability and control over flexibility and adaptiveness, which basically means you don't value agility, you value stability, which is fine. And that's absolutely okay. But then why are you doing the things that will move you towards agility, right? And that's where a lot of this resistance comes from. Again, I'll go back to the sporting analogy. If I say, and I haven't been able to go to the gym for 6 months now, right? So I'm a little more slender than I was. My problem is I disappear when I don't go to the gym, whereas get bigger. Now, if someone says to me, if I say I want to bulk up, I want to put some muscle back on because I don't want to be so skinny anymore, and they give me a regime which is cutting my food intake and running 10 miles a day, I'd say, wait, but that's going to move me away from my goals. Why would I do that? I want to build. I don't want to cut. And so if you're trying to introduce these ways of working in an organization that values stability and control, they're going to say, well, that's not giving me that. That's giving me flexibility and adaptiveness, which I don't want. So you're working against their interest. So I start with this assessment to show actually what you want is stability and predictability, right? You go and do some Lean Six Sigma or something else that will give you that and save yourself the money and the pain, right? And let me go and work with someone who does want to do it. So that's what I mean by that. And again, if you had read the chapter, George, on organizational culture, I talk a lot about how I start with using that and what kind of profile says, yes, this is a good client to work with, or what kind of profile says, you should probably do something else.
Excellent. Very, very good. So the competing values framework, you actually did a talk series around that in itself, which was quite good some time ago. So that's all covered, of course, in the book here as well to some extent. No?
Yeah. So I talk about the importance of culture. I talk about a framework for everybody. I guess my preferred one, but you can talk about Frederick Laloux, Green and Teal organizations if you want. There are many others. I just find this one to be the most valuable. But also, how do you change culture, right? Because there's one thing knowing where you are, but then the other thing is how I know where I am and where I want to be. But how do I go from A to B? Because most people struggle with that, right? So I talk a little about some patterns for shifting culture, which is universal, right? It doesn't matter which framework you're using. So I talk about that in there too, and some case studies of culture change from over the years that are really powerful as well.
Excellent, excellent. And of course, tightly linked with the organizational culture, we've got the organizational structure. And a quick quote from the book: leaders must decide which characteristics they wish to see exhibited by the value delivery system and redesign it with those in mind. What are some of those characteristics that you're thinking of there?
So you can't design for everything, right? And so it's why I like the cruise ship analogy, right? Cruise ships are not designed to be nimble, right? I mean, if you want to, they're not going to be swooping around, going through really narrow twists and turns, right? That's not what they're designed for. And oil tankers, they're designed for efficiency, they're designed for comfort, they're designed for something else, right? They're very well designed for those things, right? But if you put them in an environment, if you put them in a race, right, where they had to, go around a flag and then come back around, right, just a bit like a slalom in skiing, right? They'll be atrocious. They won't be functional in that space because they're designed for other attributes, right? Whereas a speedboat, if you put that in the race, it's super nimble. It can spin around, it can go fast, it can come back. That's designed for that. But if would you want to live on a speedboat for a month? Probably not, right? Would you want to put your goods on a speedboat and ship it halfway across the world? I imagine that would cost a fortune because it's not efficient. So you have to understand, what do you want to see from these teams? Because if you want just efficiency and predictability, maybe functional silos are the way to go, right? But if you want agility and collaboration and innovation, maybe cross-functional teams are the way to go. But the mistake I see made a lot is, well, how should we design our teams? It's like, well, what do you want your teams to achieve? Because the answer is different every time. It's like, how should I design my car? It's like, is it a family car? Is it a sports car? Like, I need to answer these questions first. And so that's what leaders need to decide what's more important to you and understand if something's more important to you, then something else is less important to you, right? If we want agility, we have to sacrifice efficiency and vice versa. Right? But be comfortable with that. I hear this a lot. It's like, but that looks really inefficient. It's like, yeah, it is. It's agile. Democracy is inefficient, right? But it doesn't, because we value something over efficiency in our political system, and it's the same with organizations. We've got to get comfortable with that. So that's what I'm trying to say there, rather awkwardly.
Yeah, no, I think that of course raises yet another good point, right? We're not living in a world of just one way or just one other way. Right, there's a lot of grayscale that we need to explore. It is a world of complexity. In the people and engagement, I guess my standard question here is: you talk about how the policies need to be updated in order to raise up the level of engagements of the workforce, of the staff.
Yeah.
What would you say is the number one policy that needs shifting in HR?
So I don't like these number ones, but I'll give you one if I had to. People need greater autonomy, right? We're probably, you're familiar with Dan Pink's work, right? Start with autonomy, mastery, purpose, right? Well, I say autonomy because that's a very strong driver for me. But you could say, you know what, having a strong sense of purpose is a real driver of engagement as well. Like, what is it we're trying to achieve? The money gets you into work, but it doesn't make you go over and above. And so, if I really believe in what we're trying to do, then maybe that's the number one driver of engagement. And we're seeing, we're seeing incredible engagement from people trying to support us through this difficult times at the moment, right? Because they believe in it. Those people who created the vaccine for COVID, I mean, talk about purpose, right? So they're going to be working all hours because they really care about it. So if you've got autonomy, mastery, purpose, that's great. But then you need trust and transparency. You need human connection, right? There are so many other drivers. You need psychological safety of engagement. And if you put those in place, you can remove the controls because people are engaged and they want to do good things. This is playing to their intrinsic motivation. Right? And so you don't need to trek people because they want to do a good job. You're not forcing them to do work. They're here to do work because you've created those conditions, right? And the story I like to tell, bless my little girl. Last year, I can see she's being homeschooled right over there. Last year in the summer we tried to grow sunflowers, right, to see who's grew the highest, right? She's only 5, bless her. She's my youngest, and she was trying to pull her sunflower to stretch it to make it bigger. And I said to her, I was like, Papa, you can't make it grow faster by doing that. She's like, how do I make it grow? I was like, you don't. You just got to make sure it has the right conditions of sunlight, of soil, of water. Then it will want to grow, right? And I was thinking, wait a minute, that sounds just like innovation, engagement, motivation. You can't force these things or command these things, right? All you can do is put the right ingredients in place, and then these things will come. And so that's kind of, those ingredients are the things we're talking about there. So you asked me for one, and I gave you about 10. Sorry about that.
Constraint opens the mind. But I love that metaphor, and it seems people like to. Thanks for another like on this one. And just as we are moving through this, if you do have any final questions for Karim while we are together, we are attempting to finish at the top of the hour, so we've got about 10 minutes left or so. Let's look at the enabler around governance and funding. So in the book, you tip your head to beyond budgeting as one approach that can be quite helpful. And from my knowledge on beyond budgeting, its big aim is to help organizations move away from the annual budgeting process. So for those unfamiliar with beyond budgeting, an organization that is currently completely set up, right? Because of course, funding and governance goes through the entirety of the organization. It basically dictates how business is done in the organization. And you mentioned in this topic about you want to encourage people to fund smaller bets and so on and so forth. But the organization is ultimately still operating with annual budgeting. What's helpful for them to move more towards this more nimble approach for funding?
So firstly, you don't need one governance approach across the whole organization, right? There'll be some business as usual activities where annual funding cycles might be the right thing to do. Now, wow, that went fast, didn't it? Let me try and answer this question quickly as I can answer questions, because I do tend to talk a lot. Now, the way I look at this, and I use gold mining as my analogy, right? I like a good analogy, and gold mining seems as good as any. And largely, you've got three phases of that, right? You've got one. Where on earth should we build the mine? Where's the gold, right? So I call that searching. Like, where is it? And when you take a searching approach, bear in mind, 0.1% of sites that are explored end up being a viable mine, which says to me, we don't know where the gold is. We'll just have to try some stuff. And so you try lots of cheap experiments. Maybe you get 100 sites and you spend $100 just checking the soil. You rule out 50 of them. You go back, you spend a bit more, right? And then you come back, maybe you rule out 25, you've got 25 left. And you keep going back and running little experiments. But ultimately, you narrow in on the things that are viable, and you've got 5 left, and these seem promising. So you go deeper. Maybe you send a team of scientists and geologists and geographers and whatever other ographers you need, and then they do a bit more experiment to validate that there's gold down there, and maybe you settle on one site. Right, you never would have picked that out of the 100 unless you ran experiments on 100, but you've now found it. You're pretty confident there's gold there through data, right? So that's your search, and that is your funding lots and lots of things, very small bets, 1 or 2 day experiments, right? Now you know where to build, you can start building, but you don't know what the mine's going to look like. So maybe a slightly bigger funding cycles, 3 months, maybe, right? To work out where should the entrance be, where should the exit be, should it be a surface mine or a deep mine, right? And these things are gonna become clear, but you know where you're building it, right? So the actual site is settled, but what it looks like isn't. And so you're doing slightly bigger funding cycles because the risk is reduced, the uncertainty is reduced, and you're going deeper, right? Until you have a plan, and then you're building it out. Stage 3 is just get the gold out, right? It is just and maybe you do annual cycles there, because we know there's gold in there. We just need to efficiently extract this gold and sell it. But if you notice, as you move through the development life cycle, and by the way, it's the same with the product, there's the sort of search for the right business model, build the product out with adaptation around the features, right? That's where Scrum comes in, and then just execute, and then just keep the lights on, right? And your funding model will be different in all 3 of those phases. So there isn't a one size fits all. There's the more experimental, and then there's the slightly less experimental as you move from exploring to exploiting. All right, so I'm conscious of the time, but I talk through that with some examples of what you might do in each of those areas.
Awesome, excellent. So once again, this is a matter of not just looking at one funding approach, but appreciating this grayscale that depending on what we're funding, we might want to fund differently. Beautiful.
Yes, and the same is true across all of those areas, by the way, because you're exploiting what you have and exploring what's new. So your team structure in the business as usual might be different to your team structure in the more innovative, creative product development world. So you've got almost these 2 modes of operation, explore and exploit. We call those ambidextrous organizations. You need different cultures, structures, and policies in each area, because there's not a one size fits all, and we need to understand we're not throwing away what works, we're just adding to it with what works in a different context.
Beautiful. So just one more time, the site 6enablers.com will be the home for the book and the canvas and everything around that. Updates going live in a few hours after this live stream. If you're watching a replay, then just go there. You'll already see it updated. Yannick has taken to your analogies and says, if currently on a cruise liner, you're used to slow-paced, luxurious travel in style, and then you're learning that you essentially need a speedboat alongside that, and making that a hard pill to swallow. So what's the sugar to help that medicine go down that you could offer to leaders?
So I mean, ultimately, it's very, you have, in order to get something, you need to let go of something, right? But the organization, and this is very difficult, right? If you look at Blockbuster, they had exactly the same problem. Why should I invest? It was $200 million, right? Why should I invest $200 million in online when we're doing very well with stores? Thank you, right? That sounds like a bad deal, right? Why should we spend another $200 million getting rid of late fees just because Netflix don't have late fees? That sounds like a bad deal. That's going to come off our bottom line. No, thank you very much. We're comfortable where we are, right? But you can be comfortable where you are until where you are stops being viable, right? So this is just one of those things. You've got to do this to remain relevant, right? And it might be a bit painful, but not doing it in the long run is going to be more painful for you once it stops going well. And it always stops going well at some point, right? Why is Amazon a relentless innovator? Amazon does pretty well. Google does pretty well. Why are they still searching for the next thing? Because what they do right now isn't going to be their cash cow forever, right? And so, yeah, it is much easier to not do it. But that takes me back to for those who know they need to change and who are brave enough to do so, right? It is brave because it's painful and it's uncertain and it's scary and it's expensive, but sometimes avoiding the risk, you end up having more risk in the long run because you don't survive. And so I would say, yeah, welcome the uncertainty, because the comfortable world won't go on forever. And so that's the message I get. I don't sugarcoat it, right? I don't say this is easy, but not doing it might work well for the next 5 years, even 10 years. But there's going to come a point where you're going to wish you did it, right? So that's that.
And that's probably a general comment. The tone of the book is very similar, so you can sense the same passion that you've exhibited throughout this conversation, and also the same groundedness. It's direct, it is helpful, it's applicable, it's practical. So yeah, once again, Karim, I would like to thank you very much for joining today for the show. So 6 Enablers of Business Agility will become available on the 1st of June, and in a few hours you'll have at 6enablers.com you'll have a little bit of a toolkit available to help you get over the next few months where you have to wait a little while longer for the book. Karim, over to you for any parting words to our viewers.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me on. It's nice to see it on a device like that. They haven't made the Kindle version yet, so that was exciting to see. Like, it all still very, very weird, the fact that I've written the book. It's still not quite resonating with my brain, but I will. So I just want to thank those who are here and those who've tuned in to watch subsequently. There's a real need to communicate this stuff to people. I hope that you're able to implement some of the things, right? You can check this out, or you can I talk about this stuff all the time if you just want to watch me yapping on about it instead of reading it, right? But ultimately, I really hope you get to do some of this stuff, because when you do this stuff, that's when the magic happens, right? That's when you can really have an impact on organizations, which is what gets me out of bed. And hopefully you get to do some of those things as well. Hopefully it'll reinforce some of the things add to that with some things you didn't know so much. So yeah, check it out and good luck with it, and reach out to me if you want to talk about anything or you have any questions. I'm quite easy to find at Karim Harbott, and my name is not one that's shared, so you can find me quite easily on social media. I'm happy to engage if you have any queries or questions about anything. But thanks for coming, and I hope some of you at least check out the book in June when it's out.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Karim. So thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you, Lars. Thank you, Yannick. Thank you for watching. And we'll be back with another show next week. Karim, once again, thank you for joining. And thank you all for tuning in. This was Team Genius Live with Karim Harbott, 6 Enablers for Business Agility, 1st of June, available on Amazon and wherever great books are sold. Mostly Amazon. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.